Now, on a bit more of a serious note, we were trying to determine how you'd describe your brand of humor. How would you describe it?
Funny.
You think you know Cheech and Chong. Two guys, a lot of smoke, and a whole lot of laughs. But here's the thing. Almost everything people assume about this duo is either incomplete, wildly oversimplified, or just flat out wrong. The real story behind Richard Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong is stranger, more complicated, and honestly more fascinating than any of their films. And by the time you reach the end of this, you're going to look at them completely differently. So settle in, because we're going deep. Before we get into the wild details, let's talk about where these two actually came from, because their backgrounds couldn't be more different, and that contrast is exactly what made them work. Richard Marin grew up in South Los Angeles in a Mexican-American household. His father was a Los Angeles Police Department officer, which makes the whole anti-establishment stoner comedian career path even more ironic when you think about it. Cheech was a bright kid who genuinely loved art. He enrolled at California State University Northridge and was seriously pursuing a degree focused on the arts. This wasn't some casual hobby. He had real academic ambitions. But the Vietnam War draft changed everything for a generation of young American men, and Cheech was no exception. Faced with the very real possibility of being sent to fight in a war he didn't believe in, he made the difficult decision to leave the United States and cross into Canada. He landed in Vancouver with very little plan and even fewer resources, taking whatever work he could find just to survive. Truck driving, unloading freight, odd jobs here and there. It was a humbling, uncertain period of his life, but it placed him exactly where he needed to be. Tommy Chong's path to that same city was entirely different. Born in Edmonton, Alberta, to a Chinese father and a Scottish-Irish mother, Tommy had already brushed up against fame before the comedy world ever found him. He was a legitimate musician who played guitar in a rhythm and blues group called Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. That band actually got signed to Motown Records, one of the most iconic labels in music history. That alone is a remarkable footnote that most people never hear about when Chong's name comes up. After the music chapter wound down, Tommy transitioned into running a venue in Vancouver's Chinatown. The place was called the Shanghai Junk, and Tommy, being Tommy, didn't want it to be just another club. He began blending burlesque performance with improvisational comedy sketches, essentially creating a hybrid entertainment space before that concept had a name. He assembled a small comedy group called City Works and had them perform between acts, experimenting with crowd reactions and live improv in real time. That is the room Cheech walked into one night in 1970, not looking for a comedy career, but looking for rent money. Tommy saw something in him immediately. The energy, the timing, the face. He invited Cheech to join the improv group almost on the spot. And within weeks of performing together, something undeniable started to emerge. The two of them had a natural back and forth that couldn't be manufactured or rehearsed into existence. It either exists between two people or it doesn't. With these two, it absolutely did. Now here's something that gets glossed over constantly when people talk about this duo. Their relationship was never a simple friendship. Not even close. In his own memoir, Cheech described their connection not as a best friendship, but more like a brotherhood. And not the warm, wholesome kind of brotherhood either. The kind where you can be furious at each other one minute, and then show up and deliver a flawless performance together the next, almost out of spite. He compared their dynamic to the process of how pearls are formed. Irritation, pressure, and time producing something unexpectedly beautiful. That's a poetic way of describing what was, by many accounts, a genuinely difficult working relationship. The creative tension between them was real, and it grew over time. Both men were intelligent, both had strong instincts, and both had egos that came with years of success. Tommy directed 4 of their 6 major films between 1978 and 1984, and while that arrangement was framed as a practical division of labor, it never sat entirely comfortably with Cheech. He felt his contributions to the creative process were being undervalued, that the public narrative was slowly turning their equal partnership into something lopsided. There's a documented moment from a later interview where Tommy bluntly told Cheech he never truly earned a directing credit. Cheech pushed back directly and firmly. That exchange wasn't just two old friends bickering. It reflected years of accumulated frustration that had never been fully addressed or resolved. By the early 80s, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. Cheech felt increasingly sidelined creatively, as though he was performing in someone else's vision rather than co-authoring the story. The final break came in 1985. Cheech had written and recorded a song called Born in East L.A., a parody of Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, and he wanted Tommy involved. Tommy declined. That refusal, whether intentional or not, communicated something that words had been dancing around for years. Cheech moved forward on his own. The song became a hit. The accompanying short film he made became a full feature that performed well both critically and commercially. It was proof that he didn't need the partnership to succeed, and it was also the official end of 17 years of working together. Tommy Chong, to his credit, later acknowledged that the collapse was largely his own doing. He described himself during that period as having developed something of a megalomaniac streak. When you're the director, he explained, your word becomes law on set. And once you get comfortable with that kind of authority, it becomes very hard to share it. It's a self-aware admission that took years to arrive at, but it says a lot about how both men grew through the experience, even if they had to grow apart first. Most people know Cheech Marin as one half of a stoner comedy duo. Far fewer people know that he is also one of the most significant collectors and advocates for Chicano art in the United States. Over several decades, Cheech quietly assembled one of the largest private collections of Chicano art in the world. We're talking about hundreds of works spanning painting, sculpture, and mixed media, pieces created by Mexican-American artists whose work had been largely excluded from mainstream museum spaces and major gallery circuits. Cheech didn't just collect for personal enjoyment. He became an active promoter, lending pieces for traveling exhibitions, giving interviews about the cultural significance of the movement, and working to change how institutions engaged with Latino artistic tradition. His efforts eventually led to something extraordinary. The Cheech Marin Center for Chicano Art and Culture opened in Riverside, California, in 2022. It was a genuine cultural landmark, a museum dedicated specifically to Chicano art, built in collaboration with the Riverside Art Museum. For a man whose public image had been defined almost entirely by stoner comedy for decades, this was a revelation to many people. But those who had followed his broader career weren't surprised at all. The kid who studied art before the draft changed his plans had never really stopped caring about it. He just found a different canvas. Tommy Chong's path after the partnership ended took its own unexpected turns, and one of them was deeply serious. In 2003, Chong became the target of a federal sting operation called Operation Pipe Dreams. The investigation targeted businesses that sold drug paraphernalia, specifically glass pipes and bongs, online and through mail order. Tommy's family ran a company called Chong Glass, later known as Nice Dreams, and it was caught up in a sweep. What made his case stand out from the others caught in the operation was the sentence he received. Tommy Chong was sentenced to 9 months in federal prison. Most other defendants in the same operation received fines or probation. Many observers, legal analysts, and civil liberties advocates argued that Chong was made an example of specifically because of his celebrity and his long association with cannabis culture in popular media. Tommy served his sentence at a federal correctional institution in California. While incarcerated, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, though he later stated he managed it and recovered. The entire experience was documented in a film called AKA Tommy Chong, directed by Josh Gilbert, which examined both the legal proceedings and the broader questions they raised about selective prosecution and free speech. Rather than becoming bitter or withdrawn, Chong emerged from prison with a renewed sense of purpose and continued to speak publicly about cannabis legalization, criminal justice reform, and the personal toll of his experience. It was a chapter of his life that forced the public to see him as more than a character from a comedy film. Here's a behind-the-scenes detail from their most famous film that most people have never heard. When Up in Smoke was being screened in its early form for test audiences and industry insiders. One of the people who showed up to watch was Jack Nicholson. This was 1978, And Nicholson was already one of the most respected actors in Hollywood. He had a small but meaningful connection to the project through producer Lou Adler. The problem was that Nicholson arrived at the screening fresh from a car accident that had left him with a dislocated shoulder. Anyone who has experienced a dislocated shoulder knows that movement, and especially the physical convulsions that come with genuine laughter, can be genuinely painful. He was told, apparently quite directly, that he should try not to laugh during the screening, for obvious medical reasons. And according to Lou Adler's recollections, Nicholson tried. He genuinely tried. But the film kept landing its jokes, and instead of actual laughter, what came out of Nicholson was a series of involuntary grunts, suppressed howls, and pain sounds as his body kept trying to laugh despite his best efforts to hold it in. Adler has described those sounds as one of the most useful pieces of feedback the team received, because if a joke could extract a painful physical reaction from someone literally trying not to respond, it was clearly working. Jack Nicholson's dislocated shoulder became an accidental quality control mechanism for one of the most successful stoner comedies ever made. And while we're on the subject of Up in Smoke, that battered Volkswagen Beetle that Tommy Chong's character drives in the film wasn't a studio prop pulled from a warehouse. It was Jack Nicholson's actual car. His personal vehicle ended up on screen in someone else's movie, being driven by the character it had presumably inspired. The creative process behind their films was almost as unconventional as the films themselves. Their 1981 feature Nice Dreams was made from a screenplay that was reportedly 3.5 pages long. Not 103 pages. Not even 30 pages. 3.5. The document outlined a general premise, sketched out a few visual ideas, and then essentially trusted the two leads to figure out the rest in real time. The original concept had them playing gardeners who were secretly cultivating marijuana all across Los Angeles. That idea eventually shifted into something involving an ice cream truck with a giant clown face on the side being used as a mobile distribution vehicle. The story evolved organically because there wasn't enough written material to constrain it. What's remarkable, though, is that despite the almost non-existent script, the film was meticulously storyboarded. Every physical gag, every piece of visual comedy, every chase sequence was mapped out in advance with careful attention to staging and timing. The looseness was all on the surface. Underneath, it was a level of technical planning that most people would never associate with Cheech and Chong style of filmmaking. This is actually a fairly sophisticated approach to comedy filmmaking. The verbal improvisation was free to breathe because the visual structure was already locked in. The result looked chaotic. The preparation behind it was anything but. There's one more dimension to this story that deserves attention, and it's the one that brings everything full circle. After nearly 2 decades apart, Cheech and Chong did eventually reunite. Their 2008 Smoking and Tokang reunion tour brought them back to stages across North America, and audiences showed up in enormous numbers to see them. But both men were candid in interviews around that time about the fact that reconciliation didn't mean everything was suddenly resolved. Cheech openly acknowledged there was still real animosity between them in certain moments. The history was too long and too complicated to be neatly packaged into a heartwarming comeback story. What they had instead was something more honest than that. Two people who had built something genuinely significant together, who had hurt each other in the process, and who could still make people laugh when they stood in the same room. The legacy of Cheech and Chong isn't really about marijuana at all. When you step back and look at the full picture, it's about two people from completely different backgrounds who found each other in an improbable place, discovered a chemistry that neither of them could have manufactured alone, and then spent decades navigating what it means to share a creative identity with another person. The art collection, the prison sentence, the dislocated shoulder, the 3.5-page script, the cop's license plate that ended up in a cult classic film. These aren't footnotes to the story. They are the story. And it's a much better one than most people ever get to hear.